It was the perfect cover, a reason to travel constantly, to disappear for weeks without suspicion, to carry blueprints and site reports. That meant one thing to his colleagues, and something else entirely to him.
At 85, her movements had slowed, but her mind remained as sharp as the autumn air whistling through the eaves above her. 3 years had passed since Glenn's death, yet some days the loss still felt as fresh as morning dew on new grass. Each box she opened was a small portal into their past, releasing memories that swirled around her like leaves caught in an October wind. The musty scent of old paper mingled with the faint, stubborn trace of his aftershave, still clinging to his belongings even now, as if some part of him refused to fully leave. Her arthritic fingers moved slowly, tracing the edges of each object with something close to reverence. There were his vintage football medals, won in the local league where he'd played goalkeeper back in the 1950s. There were pressed flowers, flattened and brittle, picked during long walks across the Salisbury Plains. There were yellowed love letters, tied together with a faded blue ribbon that had once been bright. Each item told a story she thought she already knew by heart. Nothing prepared her for what waited at the bottom of the final box. The photograph caught her eye first. Something about it demanded attention, a black and white portrait, professionally taken sometime in the early 1950s. Glenn stood against a plain backdrop, his lean frame dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, but it was his eyes that held her. Those familiar warm brown eyes, the ones that always crinkled at the corners when he smiled, held something else here. A watchfulness, a guardedness she had never once seen on the man she believed she'd known completely in every hour of every year they'd shared. In the corner, a signature, Captain G. Nothing more, simple, cryptic, impossible to place. With trembling fingers, she turned the photograph over. There, in Glenn's familiar handwriting, neat, precise, exactly like everything else about him, were 3 words that would quietly unravel the tapestry of everything she thought she remembered. Operation Nightjar Fen.
Driven by a sudden, urgent need to understand, Audrey dug deeper into the box. Beneath layers of old tax returns and yellowed engineering drawings, her fingers found an envelope, thick with age and importance.
Inside were more photographs, Glenn in different cities, different decades, always impeccably dressed, always wearing that same guarded expression. There were cryptic notes written in a private shorthand she couldn't begin to decipher, and at the very bottom, a leather-bound notebook, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. The leather was soft from years of quiet handling, its pages gone the color of weak tea. Opening it felt like crossing a threshold she couldn't uncross. As she began to read, the world she had known for 8 decades gently shifted beneath her feet. Like a floorboard she'd walked over 1,000 times, finally giving way. The first entry was dated 1943. Glenn had been barely more than a boy when a quiet government program first took notice of his extraordinary gift, a memory so precise it could hold a page of text, a map, a stranger's face, and never let it go. In those desperate wartime years when the country needed eyes and ears in places grown men couldn't reach unnoticed, a recruiter had approached his school with careful, deliberate interest. Audrey's hands shook as she read what came next, how Glenn, small and unassuming, had been trained to slip into places larger men could not. Narrow service tunnels, cramped storage rooms, the forgotten corners of buildings where careless words were spoken freely by men who never imagined they were being heard. Her mind drifted back, unbidden, to their courtship in 1952. She had been 22 then, studying home economics at the local college, the first time she saw him in Victoria Park. He'd been playing football with friends, his laughter carrying easily across the summer air. She remembered how he'd noticed her watching from the bench and jogged over to introduce himself, charm radiating off him like warmth from the afternoon sun. What she hadn't known then, what she was only learning now, 60 years later, alone in an attic, was that he had returned from Berlin only days before, where he'd helped uncover a quiet network of foreign agents operating under diplomatic cover. Their whole love story had unfolded like a dance, each step seeming to fall so naturally into place. She had always believed it was fate. Now she found herself wondering how many of their chance meetings had, in fact, been carefully arranged. How many of his ordinary business trips had quietly doubled as something else entirely. The thought should have made her angry. Instead, it filled her with a slow, aching sadness. Sadness for the enormous weight he had carried alone, for so many years, without ever once setting it down in front of her. The notebook detailed missions that spanned decades, each one entered in the same careful handwriting, growing steadier with practice, then shakier with age. After the war, Glenn's role had quietly evolved. Operation Nightjar Fen became the name written again and again across the pages, a long counterintelligence effort in which Glenn helped feed carefully constructed misinformation to those working against his country. His career as a civil engineer, she now understood, had never been an accident.
It was the perfect cover, a reason to travel constantly, to disappear for weeks without suspicion, to carry blueprints and site reports. That meant one thing to his colleagues, and something else entirely to him.
One entry, dated 1960, stopped her cold. It described a tense operation in Prague, helping a defecting scientist slip quietly across a border that was never meant to be crossed. Audrey remembered that week with sudden, startling clarity. She had been home with their 2-year-old daughter, Emma, believing wholeheartedly that Glenn was away at a conference in Manchester. He had called every single night, his voice warm, asking about Emma's first wobbling steps, her new favorite word, the way she laughed at the neighbor's dog. Not once in any of those calls had his voice betrayed even a flicker of the danger he was standing in. Near the end of the notebook, tucked between the final pages, a sealed envelope slipped out and landed softly in her lap. Her name was written across the front in Glenn's hand, though the letters here were slightly shaky, uneven in a way they hadn't been before. She realized, with a fresh wave of grief, that this must have been written in his last years, after Parkinson's had begun to steal the steadiness from his fingers. "My dearest Audrey," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the time has finally come for you to know the truth I have carried like a shadow through our whole life together. I lived 2 lives, my love, one in the light, with you and our beautiful family, and one in the quiet dark, doing work I was never permitted to speak of. I was noticed young, and that single moment shaped everything that followed. Through the war, and through the long cold years after it, I worked to protect the people I loved and the country that raised me. I helped mislead those who meant us harm. I helped prevent things I still cannot fully describe. I told myself again and again that it mattered. But my greatest deception, Audrey, was the one I practiced against you. I never wanted you to carry the fear of wondering whether each goodbye might be our last. I wanted our life to stay untouched by the shadows I moved through. You were my light, my anchor, the reason I always found my way home again, no matter how far the distance or how long the silence. The hardest part was never the missions themselves. It was coming home afterward and pretending nothing had happened, that I was simply a tired engineer, worried about nothing more than concrete and deadlines. Every time I held you, every time I kissed our children goodnight, some part of me wanted desperately to tell you everything. But I couldn't risk your safety or your peace for my own relief. You were my greatest mission, Audrey, to keep you safe, to love you honestly, even inside a life built on necessary lies. To build something real and joyful, even while I carried this weight in silence. And for that I would do it all again, without hesitation. I only hope, in time, you can forgive the deception, even as I remain certain of why I made the choice I made. Know this, above everything else. Every moment of love between us was real. Every laugh was genuine. Every quiet evening in the garden was exactly what it seemed to be. Whatever else I hid from you, you were always my truth. All my love always, Glenn. Tears fell freely down Audrey's cheeks as she pressed the letter to her heart. The man she had loved for over 6 decades had been both more and less than she'd ever known, a quiet protector working in the shadows, and through it all, still simply her husband carrying secrets. Not to deceive her, but to shield her. Slowly, her joints protesting every movement, Audrey rose and walked to the small attic window. The setting sun spread orange and violet across the sky, not unlike the countless evenings she and Glenn had spent together in their garden. Sitting in the easy, comfortable silence of 2 people who believed they knew each other's hearts completely, and perhaps she realized they had. Perhaps she had always known his heart, even without knowing the full shape of his circumstances. His kindness had been real. His integrity had been real. His deep, steady capacity for love, that had never once been a performance. The secrets he carried weren't a betrayal of their marriage. They were, in their own strange way, one more expression of how deeply he had loved her. With trembling hands but a strangely steady heart, Audrey gathered the notebook, the photographs, and the letter into her arms. These were no longer just fragments of a hidden past. They were pieces of a legacy, one that deserved finally to be told. Not simply the story of a quiet man who had helped shape history from the shadows, but the story of a husband who had somehow managed to keep his humanity and his capacity for love fully intact, even after everything he had carried. And so, with unsteady hands and a heart full of both grief and gratitude, Audrey Phillips sat down that evening to begin writing the story only she could tell.